The wind dragged dust across the dry earth as Colton Briggs watched the stagecoach approach, the horizon shimmering in the late afternoon heat. It had been 8 months since he mailed that letter. 8 months of silence. 8 months of wondering if he'd been a fool for believing a few pages could change the course of a lonely life. The deal had been simple. A photograph, a letter, and the promise of partnership marriage. Eventually, but more than that, companionship. Someone to talk to after long days with the cattle. Someone to fill the silence inside the house that still smelled like his mother's books and his father's old pipe smoke. He hadn't told anyone in town. Folks would have talked. And Colton didn't like talk. He liked results. So he worked harder than ever, cleared a room, fixed the gate, and scraped together every dollar from last season's herd to send along with that last letter. And now, as the coach came to a crunching halt in front of his ranch gate, he wiped his hands on his jeans and tried not to look like a man who hadn't spoken to a woman in 3 years. The door swung open, and the driver leaned out, tipping his hat. "You Colton Briggs?" he hollered. Colton nodded once, stiffly. "Then these two belong to you." The driver's words didn't register at first. These two? Two what? But then he saw them stepping out of the coach in unison like some kind of mirage. Two women. Same dark curls, same green eyes, same black dress with a tiny embroidered flower at the collar. Identical. Down to the way they held their gloves in their left hands and the tilt of their chins. He blinked, thinking maybe the heat was playing tricks on him. But they were real. Solid. And staring right at him. One stepped forward. "Mr. Briggs, I'm Emmeline." The other followed, smiling softly. "And I'm Clara." Then, in perfect harmony, "You wrote to both of us." Colton's stomach turned. He hadn't written to two women. He'd sent one letter to a woman named Emmeline Pruitt. He remembered the name because it had sounded like music when he first read it. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The twins exchanged a glance that held 1,000 secrets, then turned back to him with polite expectation. I think there's been a mistake," Colton managed, trying to keep his voice level. Emmeline's smile didn't falter. "No mistake," she said calmly. "We share everything." Clara stepped closer, her eyes studying the land behind him like she was cataloging the place. "The question is," she said gently, "can you handle both of us?" The stagecoach pulled away, leaving behind a swirl of dust and the creak of leather bags. Colton stood motionless as the two women brushed past him and made their way to the porch like they'd lived there their whole lives. He wasn't sure if he was being courted, conned, or chosen, but something told him this wasn't the beginning of a romance, it was the start of a test. And he had no idea what the rules were. Colton watched them from the porch, arms crossed, heart thudding a slow, confused rhythm in his chest. The two women stood in the living room now, his living room, each claiming space like they'd been there before. Clara set her bag down beside the fireplace, calm and deliberate. Emmeline perched on the edge of the rocking chair his mother used to read in, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. They hadn't spoken a word to each other since entering, but the air between them felt heavy, tense, like something had already been said before they ever arrived. Colton finally stepped through the doorway, his boots hitting the floorboards louder than he intended. "I need someone to explain what the hell is going on," he said, voice low but steady. "I sent one letter, to one woman." Emmeline didn't flinch, and I wrote back. Her eyes met his, sharp and unbothered. "I never lied." Clara turned slowly toward him, her expression softer. "She's right. But you should know when you wrote to Emmeline Pruitt. You were writing to both of us." Colton narrowed his eyes. "You're telling me you both go by the same name?" "Not exactly," Emmeline replied, standing now, the rocking chair stilling behind her. "Legally, I'm Emmeline. Clara took my last name when we started over." Colton looked between them. Started over from what? The silence that followed was too long. Clara's gaze drifted to the window, and for the first time, he saw something tremble behind those calm green eyes. "It doesn't matter right now," she murmured. "What matters is we're here because we need a place to build a life. And you offered one." Colton rubbed the back of his neck. "I didn't offer a house to two women. I offered a home to one bride." Emmeline crossed the room toward him, stopping just close enough that he could smell the faint hint of rosewater clinging to her. "Then marry me," she said. "I'm the one you wrote to. Clara's just my sister." She came for support. "Is that true?" he asked, turning to Clara. She hesitated. "I came because I didn't trust her to come alone." Her voice was quiet, almost apologetic. She has a way of getting what she wants, and sometimes she doesn't think about the cost. Emmeline's head snapped toward her sister, eyes flashing. That's not fair. But it's true, Clara said, finally meeting her twin's gaze. The tension crackled like dry brush in summer heat. Colton could feel himself being drawn into something complicated, something messy and real. He'd expected a handshake, maybe an awkward conversation over supper. Instead, he was standing between two women who looked the same, spoke with the same voice, but carried entirely different energies, one a storm, the other a quiet field after lightning. And he didn't know which one he'd actually invited into his life. I need time, he said finally, to think, to figure out what this island. Neither woman argued. Emmeline turned away with a flick of her skirt. Clara simply nodded. But Colton knew deep down time was the one thing he might not have. The next morning broke with the familiar sound of hooves against dirt and the distant lowing of cattle. Colton rose before dawn like always, trying to ground himself in the rhythm of ranch life, feeding the horses, checking the fence lines, and clearing his head with the kind of work that usually pushed thoughts away. But not today. Every corner of his mind was filled with those two women in his house. He couldn't tell if it was the silence between them that unsettled him more, or the way they seemed to understand exactly what he was thinking before he even spoke. By the time he came in for coffee, both sisters were already at the kitchen table. Emmeline had claimed the seat at the head, casually sipping from a chipped mug like she owned the place. Clara sat off to the side, cutting apples with practiced precision, her eyes fixed on the blade rather than him. "You've got chores around here?" Emmeline asked, gesturing toward the window. "We can help." Colton paused mid-sip, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to sharing work, let alone sharing it with two strangers who looked like they'd stepped out of a dream he hadn't meant to have. "Plenty to do," he said cautiously. "Fences need mending. Feed storage needs organizing. There's always something." Emmeline stood and rolled up her sleeves without waiting for an invitation. "Then let's get to it." Clara followed, quieter, but just as capable. As they stepped outside, Colton couldn't help noticing how easily they moved in sync, identical in form, but not in energy. Emmeline moved with purpose, Clara with care. By noon, the three of them were repairing the southern fence. Emmeline worked beside Colton, hammering with more strength than he expected, while Clara hauled rails from the wagon, her movements slower but more deliberate. At first, he appreciated the help. But soon, the presence of both women began to pull at him like opposing currents. Emmeline filled the silence with sharp, witty remarks, making him chuckle more than he had in years. Clara, on the other hand, offered quiet observations about the land, about the sky, about things he rarely spoke aloud but often thought to himself. And then, just before lunch, he noticed something strange. His pocket knife was missing from the fence post where he'd left it. "Anyone seen my knife?" he asked. Both women shook their heads. He scanned the dirt around them, then glanced toward the wagon. Nothing. It was right here. "Could have fallen into the grass," Clara offered gently. Emmeline just shrugged. "It's a knife, Colton. You've probably got others." But it wasn't just the knife. Later that day, a rope went missing from the barn, then one of his logbooks. Each time, both women denied seeing anything. And though no accusation passed his lips, suspicion took root. This ranch wasn't meant for three people who didn't trust each other. Colton felt it in his bones. Something was off. And whatever it wasn't going to stay buried for long. By the third day, Colton had gone from curious to cautious. The ranch had taken on a strange quiet, not the peaceful kind he was used to, but a silence that felt measured, even calculated. Emmeline still dominated the space like she was born to lead, offering suggestions on how to improve the house, asking questions about his finances that felt too forward, too soon. Clara remained reserved, but there was a sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there when she stepped off the stagecoach. Colton didn't know which woman to trust, if either, and more unsettling still, both had started telling stories from their past that didn't quite match. It started with a conversation over supper. Emmeline spoke about their childhood near the Mississippi, how their father was a riverboat man who died when they were 10. Clara, without thinking, later corrected her, said their father had been a carpenter and passed during a winter fever, not on a boat. The room fell silent. Emmeline laughed it off. "I meant our uncle. He was the one who drowned. Clara just mixes things up when she's tired." But Colton caught the way Clara's eyes dropped to her plate, her lips pressed tightly together like she wanted to speak but had learned better. That night, Colton stayed up late in the barn, under the pretense of fixing a broken latch. But truthfully, he needed distance space to think. He took out the letter Emmeline had written him, folded now with soft creases from being read too many times. Her handwriting was elegant, practiced, but something about the phrasing it had always struck him as oddly formal. She'd written about loss, about longing, about how the West offered a clean slate for a woman with a complicated past. He'd thought it poetic. Now it sounded more like a warning. As he tucked the letter back into his coat pocket, a noise made him freeze. Footsteps. Light. Quick. Then whispers. He slipped behind a stack of hay bales, peeking out just enough to see the sisters. They stood near the chicken coop, backlit by the moon, facing each other like two halves of a mirror. "You weren't supposed to say that about Father," Clara hissed. "He's going to start asking questions." Emmeline waved her off. "Let him. We've come too far to backpedal now. We agreed on the story," Clara said, her voice cracking. "And you keep changing it." "I'm adjusting," Emmeline replied coolly. "It's what I do." Colton felt his chest tighten. The missing knife, the conflicting backstories, the look in Clara's eyes, it all painted a picture he didn't like. He thought he was inviting a bride into his home. Now he wasn't even sure he hadn't invited a lie. As he stepped back into the shadows, his boot shifted a loose stone, sending a clatter through the stillness. The sisters froze. Emmeline turned her head sharply. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Clara nodded, but neither of them moved to investigate. They just stared into the dark, as if they already knew someone was watching. Colton didn't sleep that night. He lay awake listening for footsteps, for whispers, for the soft creak of floorboards that might betray movement. But the house stayed eerily quiet. In the morning, Clara was the first one in the kitchen, already boiling water for coffee, sleeves rolled up, her hair braided neatly down her back. She greeted him with a soft smile, like nothing had happened the night before, like she hadn't stood under moonlight arguing about a lie she was helping carry. "You sleep all right?" she asked. Colton nodded, but didn't answer. Her eyes lingered on him, searching for something, perhaps forgiveness, perhaps understanding. Whatever it was, he didn't have it to give. Not yet. Emmeline appeared an hour later, barefoot and radiant, as if she hadn't a single care in the world. She offered no apology for the missing rope, or the broken story about their father, or the way she had inserted herself into every corner of Colton's life with the confidence of someone who knew she wouldn't be told no. She simply sat beside him at the table and asked if the hens had been laying better. He gave her the same non-answer. He gave Clara an unreadable grunt, halfway between acceptance and suspicion. But as the hours passed, Colton noticed something peculiar. Clara stayed close. She followed him out to the shed, offered help sorting tools, fixed a busted hinge on the gate without being asked. She moved gently, spoke rarely, and when she did, it was never about herself. Always about the land, the animals, the way clouds looked heavy with late summer rain. She was present in a way that made him feel like he wasn't alone, but not suffocated either. There was comfort in her silence. Emmeline, on the other hand, kept her distance. Not physically, she still appeared for meals, still offered suggestions on how to modernize the barn, still asked him, half teasingly, why he didn't smile more, but something had shifted. She began lingering around the edges of the property, standing under the pecan tree for no reason, watching the hills with her arms crossed. Once, he found her in the upstairs hallway, staring at the closed door to the spare room, her hand hovering just above the handle like she'd forgotten why she came. When she noticed him watching, she smiled too quickly and turned away. Later that evening, while putting tools back into the shed, Colton glanced toward the barn and saw a figure in the shadows. Clara, alone, her hands buried in her coat pockets, her posture stiff. He walked toward her quietly. She didn't flinch when he approached. "You all right?" he asked. She hesitated. "You ever feel like you've been dragged into something bigger than you thought?" He gave her a long look. "I do now." She offered a sad smile. "She means well, Colton. She just doesn't know how to stop when she started something." He wanted to ask what Emmeline had started, but part of him already knew. This wasn't about one letter or one bride anymore. It was about something broken between these two women that had somehow landed in his lap, and the more time passed, the more certain he became. Only one of them was telling him the truth. The night settled over the ranch like a wool blanket, heavy and suffocating. Crickets filled the air with their dull chatter, but beneath it, Colton could hear something else, soft voices, far too close to be imagined. He rose from bed quietly, careful not to let the old floorboards creak under his boots. The sisters had gone to bed hours earlier at least, that's what they claimed. But now, through the warped pane of his window, he saw them. Two dark silhouettes, cloaked in silver moonlight, standing just behind the barn, half hidden by the shadows of the overhang. Their words came in fragments, sharp and urgent, like a conversation they'd had a dozen times before and would have a dozen times more. "I told you he's starting to notice," Clara whispered, arms folded across her chest. Her voice trembled not from fear, but from exhaustion. "He's not stupid, Em. The stories don't line up. The missing things. He's watching us." Emmeline's voice was lower, harder to hear, but her posture was unchanged, defiant, unyielding. "Then let him watch. He has no idea what we've done for him already." "What you've done," Clara corrected. "I came to keep you from going too far, but you always go too far." Colton crouched behind a pile of chopped firewood, heart pounding. He couldn't move, couldn't blink. The sisters' words washed over him like cold rain, each sentence unraveling the thin thread of trust he'd been holding on to. Emmeline stepped forward, closing the space between her and Clara, her hands clenched into fists. "I gave us a future," she hissed. "He was a name on a list, but he's more than that now. He can give us a clean slate. You want to throw that away?" Clara looked away, toward the dark horizon. "You act like it's your choice, but you're dragging both of us down, Em. Just like before." Before. Stuck in Colton's chest like a thorn. How far back did this go? How many times had they done something like this? He thought of the letter, the photo, the stories, the way Emmeline walked through his life like it belonged to her. But now, it all felt rehearsed, scripted. Clara's reluctance made more sense now, not just nerves, but guilt. And Emmeline? She was never unsure, never shaken, only determined. Then Emmeline said something that chilled him. "We're running out of time. One of us has to make the move, before he starts asking real questions." Clara stepped back. "I won't be part of it. Not again." That word again echoed in Colton's mind. He stood, slowly, silently, and made his way back to the house, his thoughts spinning faster than his boots could carry him. They weren't just hiding something. They were planning something. Something Clara regretted. Something Emmeline hadn't let go of. As he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, one truth began to take shape. This had never been about marriage. He wasn't the prize. He was the piece they needed to finish something they'd already started. And whatever it wasn't over yet. The next morning came late, with a sky the color of old ash, and the kind of quiet that warned of a storm no one could yet see. Colton didn't speak much over breakfast. He watched Emmeline hum as she stirred the eggs, watched Clara keep her head low as she folded napkins like she needed her hands to be busy. It was a strange routine, like a dance they'd practiced elsewhere on another ranch, in another man's kitchen. Every word they spoke to him felt dipped in something rehearsed, something that waited for him to fall for the act. And for the first time, he realized that maybe he already had. By midday, he hitched his horse and rode into town. He didn't tell them where he was going, just said he needed to pick up supplies. Emmeline offered to ride along. Clara didn't. He turned them both down. The general store was quiet as usual, with old Elmer posted behind the counter chewing the same tobacco he always had. But Colton didn't come for feed or nails. He went straight to the back, where the postmaster kept his tiny office, tucked beside sacks of flour and rows of canned peaches. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped in. Wallace, the clerk, looked up from his stool, surprised. "Well, I'll be Colton Briggs. You all right? You look like you seen a ghost." Colton pulled the folded letter from his pocket and placed it on the desk. "You remember this coming through here?" Wallace adjusted his glasses, squinting at the paper. "Sure do. Pretty handwriting. Real fancy. Showed up about 6 months back, marked as a reply to a mail-order ad." "You sure it was meant for me?" Colton asked, voice low. Wallace raised an eyebrow. "Well, it came to this town, care of the Briggs Ranch, but now that you mention it," he stood, rummaged through a filing drawer behind the desk. "Hold on. I keep copies. Out here, you learn to be careful." After a moment, he pulled out a dog-eared envelope. "This is the original." Colton took it with hesitant fingers. The handwriting matched, but the name didn't. It wasn't addressed to Colton Briggs. It was addressed to C. Brigham. A man who had died 3 years ago in a cattle stampede just west of town. A man whose ranch bordered Colton's before it burned down under suspicious circumstances. His hands tightened on the envelope. "You said this came 6 months ago?" "Right." Wallace nodded. "But it sat here for weeks. No one came for it. Then out of nowhere, a woman showed up asking if we had any mail for Brigham. Said she was a cousin or something. I figured it was kin trying to close out his affairs." Colton felt the world narrow around him. He had never placed an ad. He had never written first. That meant the reply he received, the one from Emmeline, was never meant for him. He had been pulled into something that didn't start with him. Something that began with a lie. And maybe a fire. Something that still had unfinished business. And now he was the one standing in the middle of it, with no clue what was coming next. Colton didn't speak a word the entire ride back from town. The sky above him had darkened into a bruised violet, swollen with clouds that hadn't decided whether to rain or split open. He gripped the reins tighter than necessary, not from the threat of weather, but from the rising certainty that he'd never been part of a love story. He'd been part of a cover-up, a replacement, a shield for something too tangled to explain in a letter. By the time he reached the ranch, he was soaked with sweat. Though the wind had gone cold, the sisters were on the porch waiting, Emmeline standing tall and composed, Clara sitting with her arms wrapped around her knees like a child expecting punishment. He dismounted without a word, tossed the reins, and walked straight past them. "Colton," Emmeline called after him, but he didn't stop. He went inside, dropped the envelope on the kitchen table, and waited. They followed. Slowly. Clara's face had gone pale. Emmeline glanced at the letter but didn't touch it. "You went to town," she said softly. Colton looked up at her, jaw tight. The letter wasn't addressed to me. Silence filled the room like a third sister. It was for a man named Brigham. He died 3 years ago. Clara sat down, burying her face in her hands. Emmeline didn't move. "You weren't supposed to find that out yet," she said, not in defense but almost in regret. Colton's voice was razor thin. "Why did you come here?" Emmeline sighed and leaned against the wall, her confidence cracked but not broken. "We were promised something. By Brigham. Before he died. He wasn't just a rancher. He was running a business. One that traded favors. Secrets. People." Colton's eyes narrowed. "What kind of business?" Clara finally lifted her head. "He promised to get us out. We were trapped working under his thumb. Cleaning, cooking, smiling for visitors we didn't want. He said he'd help us start fresh. But he died," Emmeline added. "And when he did, he left everything behind, including a few people who thought we knew too much." Colton felt the air change. "So you needed somewhere to hide?" Emmeline nodded. "No one asks questions when a woman arrives as a bride. It's the perfect cover." Clara's voice cracked. "We thought if we just blended in, just long enough, if someone came looking, they'd see a married couple and keep moving. We needed a place to vanish, not a partner. Not at first." Colton stared at the letter. The ink slightly faded now. What he'd thought was fate, or loneliness answered, had been a calculated move. A trick. But it wasn't just that. Not anymore. He'd seen their fear, their loyalty to each other, and something raw and real beneath it all. "Who's after you?" he asked. Clara closed her eyes. "Men who think we still know where the books are. The money, or who was on Brigham's list." Colton didn't speak. He just stood there, realizing the truth. He was never meant to be a groom. He was meant to be a decoy. Or worse, a shield. And now, he had a choice. Run them off. Or stand in the way of something darker than he'd ever let into his life. The wind howled that night like it knew what was coming. Colton stood at the barn door with his rifle in hand, staring out into the black. The sisters were inside, windows shuttered, lamps dimmed. After everything they'd told him about Brigham, about the men who might come looking, about the letter that was never meant for him, he still couldn't walk away. Maybe he should have. Maybe the smart thing would have been to tell them to get off his land, to disappear the same way they had arrived. But the problem was, he believed them. He believed Clara's shaking hands and Emmeline's calculated bravery were two sides of the same broken coin. And somewhere between truth and lies, he had become part of the story, whether he wanted to be or not. He hadn't spoken much after their confession, just asked one question. "How long do we have?" Emmeline looked him in the eye and said, "Days. Maybe less." That was all he needed. Colton wasn't a man of many words. He was a man of fences and sweat and knowing the weight of silence. But now, He was a man preparing for trouble. He boarded the windows, reinforced the locks, saddled the horses with extra supplies. And while he worked, the sisters moved differently, like people who knew how to disappear. But that night, something shifted. After supper, Emmeline sat across from him at the table, the fire between them casting long shadows on the walls. "If it comes to it," she said, "you'll have to choose." "Between what?" he asked. "Between us," Clara said quietly, emerging from the hallway. "They'll want one of us, maybe both, but they'll only need one to talk." Colton set his coffee down. "That's not a choice I'm making. You may not get that luxury," Emmeline said. Her voice had no edge, just a strange kind of sadness. "You're the only person left in this whole stretch of land who doesn't know what we're worth." Clara moved closer, her fingers brushing his arm. "We didn't come here to trap you. But once we saw that you weren't like him, we realized we didn't want to run anymore. We wanted a chance. A real one." Her voice cracked on the last word. Colton looked between them, the firelight flickering across their faces, two mirrors of the same pain. "You asked me to choose," he said, voice low. "But I already did." He stood, walked to the mantel, and removed the old tin lockbox that held the deed to the ranch. He opened it, took out a blank sheet of parchment, and slid it across the table. "You both stay, under my name, my roof, and if anyone comes asking, they'll find a man who won't back down and a household that doesn't break apart under threats." The sisters stared at him, stunned into silence. No trick, no conditions, just a decision that, for the first time, wasn't born out of loneliness but choice. That night, as thunder rolled over the hills, the ranch wasn't just a hiding place anymore. It was a stand. And Colton Briggs wasn't just a cowboy with a letter. He was the answer they never saw coming.